airline flights prove a flat, stationary Earth? I've made several videos on this specific topic, but I continue getting the same non-arguments ad nauseum, which have already been demolished by basic logic covered in several videos and experiments. I get pretty tired of manually typing out these very same proofs over and over and over again to each individual person who parrots the exact same non-arguments that I've shown to be irrelevant, because that's what they're told by others who believe the Earth is a spinning globe. This video was created to end this ridiculous discussion once and for all, with the selfish motivation of preventing myself from having to manually type out this information to each and every person who feels they've debunked the fact that westbound flights should be way shorter than eastbound flights if the Earth is actually a constantly spinning globe. The problem is, a westbound flight from New York to LA is often identical in duration to the return flight from LA to New York. There's no possible way for the flights to be even remotely similar on the spinning globe Earth, let alone identical in duration. So the arguments against this basic proof of a stationary Earth are pretty common. The first one is, the airplanes were spinning with the face of the Earth prior to takeoff, and therefore the airplanes will continue spinning with the face of the Earth for the duration of the journey, regardless of the direction of travel or altitude. In other words, the airplanes will never escape the rotational frame of reference only lent to them by the allegedly spinning Earth. The second argument is, well, the atmosphere is constantly spinning with the face of the Earth, so the planes are velcroed to the rotational frame of reference with the ground because the atmosphere is velcroed to the rotational frame of reference with the ground, even up to tens of thousands of feet or even many miles into the air. The third argument is the two flights are not identical. The eastbound flights are shorter than the westbound flights sometimes, so you're lying. Now, I've made several videos completely discrediting these arguments against the fact that the flights are often identical in duration, but it appears that people would like to debunk the flat Earth and are somehow incapable of watching videos or considering basic facts that happen to demolish their ludicrous position. So this video will be the last one I make, hopefully, proving this point conclusively once and for all. The first thing to point out is that most people will always think the Earth is a spinning globe, no matter what. So regardless of the proof that you show them, even if it conclusively demonstrates that the world is stationary, they will forever continue thinking that the Earth is a spinning globe, no matter what, so I must be stupid for proving it's not spinning. They'll go ask a physicist whether or not the Earth is spinning, or whether this proof I'm pointing to is valid, and of course the physicist will assert that I'm wrong because we all know the Earth is a spinning globe. That's apparently how modern science works. We must disregard basic observations and proof that are contrary to the doctrine of a spinning spherical Earth, which means the world will always be a spinning sphere to people who refuse to consider the truth. Regardless of the evidence presented, physicists will always maintain the position that the Earth is spinning. So let me give you an analogy real quick to illustrate this point and how ridiculous their position is. Let's say you believe in Santa Claus, and so does your little brother. If you were to find your mother's handwriting on the to from information on presents from Santa, and you begin questioning whether Santa was real. Now, if you ask your little brother what he thought about Mom's handwriting on the to from information on a present from Santa, do you think your little brother is going to logically conclude that Santa is fake? Or would you expect them to make up some excuse to discredit this evidence and continue believing that Santa is real no matter what? I'm certain they would come up with some reason why Mom had to fill in the label on the presents, because we all know Santa is real and maybe he's just not that great with writing. I don't know. But Mom and Dad would never lie about this, right? Not to mention, if Mom and Dad were Santa, then we'd have Christmas every day. That's the sort of illogic we have to deal with when we're talking about physicists who believe the Earth is a spinning globe, no matter what. Okay, so this is a similar situation we have with asking a physicist how the two flights could have, identical duration or even similar duration on a spinning globe. They're going to assume the world is a spinning globe and construct some wild position and illogical rationality to show the flights would have identical duration even on a spinning globe, which is ridiculous. Okay, so the first thing we should do is demonstrate the problem I'm pointing to. I've done several videos covering this, guess, but for some reason people refuse to watch them or refuse to consider the possibility that the world might actually be stationary. By the way, the only explanation for the flights being identical in duration is if the world is actually stationary, not spinning, not at any rate whatsoever, not to mention faster than sound near the equator, which it allegedly is. No matter how much you try to cram this observation with the two flights being identical to fit the spinning globe Earth model, you're just trying to find excuses why Santa is real. Seriously, it's a very good analogy. Okay, so to cover the first argument being the airplanes were spinning with the face of the Earth prior to takeoff, and therefore the airplanes continue spinning with the face of the Earth for the duration of the journey, this is the most ridiculous, pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-scientific argument designed by impossibly gullible people who wish to propagate the spinning globe Earth model no matter what. The first point to explain is the Coriolis effect. If you're not familiar with the Coriolis effect, it's a natural characteristic of objects attached to a rotating body fixed to such a rotational frame of reference. If you're on a merry-go-round holding a ball firmly in your hands, everything stuck to the merry-go-round is fixed to this rotational frame of reference so long as it's held fast to the rotating body. On a merry-go-round, a ball in your hands will certainly remain fixed to the rotational frame of reference so long as you hold it firmly in your hands. Now, if you let go of the ball and simply drop it, the ball will sort of keep its angular momentum, but will not retain its rotational frame of reference. If you drop the ball from a few feet up, it'll definitely land near your feet, but it would slightly slip out of that rotational frame of reference during its short fall to the ground. On the other hand, if you throw the ball up into the air or across the merry-go-round to someone standing opposite you, the ball will absolutely not remain fixed to that rotational frame of reference, spinning around the axis as it did when firmly held in your hands. In other words, if you throw the ball straight up, it will not continue spinning around the central axis and will immediately slip out of the rotating frame of reference, apparently traveling in the opposite direction as the rotating body. This is such a basic, obvious fact that's admitted by science. The Coriolis effect is actually used to prove the globe, believe it or not. So, if you observe cyclones, they will rotate in opposite directions depending on their position relative to the equator, or so it would seem. Actually, the dividing line between the clockwise and counterclockwise rotating cyclones is not fixed to the equator at all, but instead the dividing line between typhoons and hurricanes actually follows the circular path of the sun in its seasonal pass from Capricorn to Cancer. This is sort of besides the point, but the fact that the dividing line between the rotating weather patterns isn't fixed to the equator shows that the Coriolis effect is not responsible for the opposing rotational directions of typhoons versus hurricanes. Instead, the path of the sun, depending on the season, creates the dividing line or the dividing circle. In order to discard the flight times conundrum proving the stationary Earth, you must discard the Coriolis effect, which is a law of physics related to rotating bodies as a fixed frame of reference. The problem with that is globe earthers use the Coriolis effect to prove the rotating Earth, and you simply can't point to the Coriolis effect as proof of a spinning globe and ignore the Coriolis effect when it proves the world is stationary. The fact is, as the sun travels in circuits overhead, it acts as sort of a hot mixing spoon or an oar through the water, stirring up the atmosphere in a constant path around the center, North Pole, with the radius of the sun's path decreasing as it turns to the northern summer and increasing during the southern summer. Weather patterns north of the sun spin in one direction, while weather patterns south of the sun will spin in the opposite direction. The sun travels from Capricorn to Cancer during the course of 6 months, and then back during the course of the next 6 months, and the dividing line of rotating atmospheric patterns follows along with that circular path of the sun. Look at an oar propelling a canoe, or run a cupped hand through a bathtub full of water. You'll notice that the water on one side of your oar or your hand will rotate clockwise, and the water on the opposite side of the oar will rotate counterclockwise. This is a natural phenomenon of fluid dynamics, and the very same principle applies to the cyclones on Earth. Believe it or not, atmosphere behaves exactly like a liquid, only on a larger scale. If you consider that the sun itself is acting like an oar, perturbing the air away from the center of its path, it becomes very clearly obvious that the atmosphere south of the sun is rotating in the opposite direction as the atmosphere north of the sun. In other words, the Coriolis effect is not responsible for cyclones rotating in opposite directions, as that would have to be fixed to the equator, but instead, it's just the way liquids or atmosphere or gases behave when perturbed by an outside force cutting through the center of the medium. This is a very simple physical law of fluid dynamics, and it explains the opposing rotation of cyclones, and the fact that the dividing line is not fixed to the equator proves conclusively that the Coriolis effect is not the cause of opposing cyclonic rotation in reality. Now, with that being said, the Coriolis effect would necessarily apply to any object fixed to the ground, fixed to the rotational frame of reference, which is then released from the ground and propelled in any direction contrary to the circuit around the central axis of rotation. Not to confuse the issue here, but an airplane before takeoff could be considered as fixed to the rotational frame of reference as the ground below. However, the instant the plane leaves the ground and begins to propel itself west, for one example, the argument that the plane will never escape the eastward rotating frame of reference is absurd and totally anti-scientific. You must totally abandon the Coriolis effect as a natural phenomenon which applies to rotating objects as a fixed frame of reference to maintain this position. The simple fact is, once the airplane takes off, it would absolutely never remain fixed to the eastward velocity, which is only lent to it by the hypothetically rotating face of the Earth. As planes gain altitude and bank in different directions, it will further slip out of that fixed frame of reference attributed to the ground below. In the case of the westbound plane traveling in the opposite direction as the spin, it would certainly retain some of that eastward velocity for a very limited duration. Unfortunately for the spinning globe, once the plane leaves the ground and continues to propel itself west, it would constantly slip further and further out of that rotating frame of reference lent to it by the face of the Earth before takeoff, and this factor would increase as the plane ascends and accelerates in the opposite direction as the spin. As the plane accelerates, the ground below would continue spinning eastward around a curve, and the plane would be hauling ass in the opposite direction and could simply never remain fixed to the velocity relative to the ground below. In order to stop such a westbound plane, the pilot would have one hell of a time slowing back down to the exact eastward frame of reference attributed to the ground below, and would need to haul ass eastward just to attempt to return to the ground's velocity east, or return to that frame of reference.